So what I'm going to talk to you about is, in large part, an overview of the kind of research I've been working on for the past 20 years, and it's focusing particularly on this COVID pandemic and what immigration looked like, skilled immigration before the pandemic and after. So just to give you some context, because I get the feeling from some of the discussion today that people don't quite realize the historical challenges that Canada has had in integrating skilled immigrants and immigrants more generally. Canada is really an exception on this front. So through the 1980s, 1990s, into the early 2000s, it was a massive, dramatic deterioration in the economic performance of new immigrants to Canada. That was documented in this paper in 2005, where we tried to explain what the causes of this deterioration was. And I think a lot of that research led to a lot of policy changes. Philip referred to the Express Entry program, which I think was a part of this movement away from the way things used to be done to try and address this deterioration. The deterioration has definitely stabilized. It hasn't continued to worsen, but it still is a challenge. So these are earnings. These are average earnings of university-educated immigrants. What we do in this analysis, this is a recent paper, we compare immigrants from a particular origin country, say China or India or the Philippines, and we compare their earnings to similarly educated and aged native-born workers within that destination or host country. So what this number, for example, tells us is that university-educated Chinese immigrants in the U.S., on average, within their first 5 years of arriving, earn 12% less than Americans with similar education, American-born workers with similar education. So the Chinese are doing a bit worse. In Canada, that gap's twice as big. If you look at Indian-born skilled immigrants in the U.S., they are outperforming Americans by a substantial margin. In Canada, it's an even bigger gap than among the Chinese. If you look at Filipinos skilled immigrants in the U.S., a gap, but not that big. In Canada, that's an enormous gap. They're earning 34% less on average. And this is even evident when you look at people born in North America. So this number are Canadians working in the U.S. They're outperforming their American counterparts, U.S.-born counterparts. These are Americans working, living in Canada, and they're also outperforming. So there's some positive selectivity there, but it's not nearly as big. And so there's something going on here. What is it? And we can compare these numbers with Australia. We have in this paper. This has been recently published in the Journal of Labor Economics. And you see not nearly as big a difference. Australia tends to fall in the middle here, closer to Canada, but falls in the middle. So Canada is really exceptional. We've also looked at other outcomes like patenting rates. If you're interested in innovation, we look at how many patents are being created by immigrants in Canada. In the US, immigrants tend to contribute a lot to innovation. In Canada, very little. So there are challenges in Canada that certainly can't be ignored. So the question is, well, what is it? What's the cause? That's the first order question. And what, if you're going to kind of put this into two groups, what you want to know first and foremost is, does this reflect something about the immigrants in Canada that they're different? Or does it reflect something about our labor markets in Canada that somehow we integrate them differently and not as successfully? Okay, and the answer to that question is going to, of course, point towards the solution, because if it's about the immigrants, then the solution has to emphasize selection. But if it's about our labor markets, then it's going to emphasize settlement. Okay, so the reality is that in Canada, the discourse, and even what I've heard in the talks I've heard so far today in this one-day conference, is in Canada, we tend to emphasize in the popular discourse the role of employer discrimination and also credential recognition issues. Okay, if you read the economics literature on immigration, that's not the answer you get. Overwhelmingly, the evidence is not that the challenges of Canada, those differences we just saw between Canada and the US, are not because US employers don't discriminate against immigrants and Canadian employers do. That's not the explanation. It's not the explanation that US employers recognize foreign credentials and Canadian employers don't. That doesn't explain it. These are massive differences. if you want to know what explains it, it's overwhelmingly about immigrant skills and about selectivity, and in particular, self-selection. I mean, we all know that Canada struggles to retain their top talent. A Nobel Prize was won by a Canadian labor economist who I've worked with. I know him quite well, David Card. On last Monday, he won the Nobel Prize in economics. He grew up in Guelph, Ontario. My PhD supervisor during my PhD was a superstar labor economist, went to the US. I mean, there are a lot of examples of this. So we struggle to retain top talent and to attract top talent. If you look at data from the OECD on the literacy skills of immigrants, what you see is that the returns to adult literacy skills in Canada are virtually identical for immigrants and natives. The return to human capital that Dimitri was talking about is almost identical, but the levels of human capital of immigrants and natives are very different. I've recently written a paper where we got permission to look at the grades, the academic performance of international students at a very large Ontario university that admits a very large number of international students. And it's evident there as well. Even among these international students, you see international students struggle relative to Canadian-born students, okay? So the reality is that there is lots of evidence that we struggle in selection. Whether that's self-selection or whether it's our screening processes, we struggle. On settlement, that's not to say that there aren't credential recognition issues, that there isn't employer discrimination. Of course there is, but that's not what's driving overwhelmingly these numbers. I should also say that in Canada, we don't do a very good job of evaluating our settlement programs. If you saw who won the Nobel Prize on Monday and you read about it, you will know that Nobel Prize was given for what's been coined the credibility revolution and how we do program evaluation. Josh Angrist has been a pioneer in that area. Labor economists use a lot of those techniques to try and credibly evaluate training programs like immigrant language training programs. But if you read the internal evaluations that are done by RCC, they just don't use those methods at all. There's an excellent potential in 2009. There was something called a language voucher pilot program where they randomized language training vouchers that have no real financial value. You could use such a setup. Now we have many years after that to study the impact of that language training in a randomized quasi-controlled experiment. I've been trying to get that through IRCC for 5 years and they have no interest in it. So we have a problem in Canada that we don't really want to know what the impacts of our settlement programs are either. Okay, so the biggest problem I have with a lot of the discussion around immigration is you hear a lot of normative statements about what should be and what policy is a good policy and what policy is a bad policy and what do we like about a country's immigrations and I always find these things very difficult to think about because it's very difficult for an economist to judge or make a normative statement about something if we don't know what the objective is. We need an objective function, preferably a mathematical objective function that we can use calculus to optimize, but at least you got to define what the objective is. And the reality is for most countries in the world, large immigrant receiving countries in particular, there are multiple objectives. We have multiple objectives in our legislation. But so this is coincidentally the first Nobel Prize winner in economics. He won his Nobel Prize in 1969, Jan Tinbergen. And his famous rule is that for every objective, there must be at least one policy instrument, at least one. So if your objective is to raise the average, to leverage immigration, to raise the average human capital of your population in order to boost economic growth, then you need at least one instrument to do that, to achieve that, to raise the average human capital. Okay, and that very much is the approach that Canada has taken. This happened in the late 90s after many years of going back and forth between arguing that what economic immigration should do in Canada is it should meet current labor market needs There were many periods where that's what we sought to do. But in the late 90s and going into the ERPA legislation in 2002, we said the objective in Canada is to maximize human capital. Where does that come from? It comes from economic growth models. If you look at a model like a solo swan model, it's very clear. The way you raise economic growth is you raise the average human capital of the population. Trying to target current labor market needs is futile. So market needs are volatile. They're difficult to forecast. By the time you bring in immigrants to fill those needs are gone. The bigger problem that people, non-economists, struggle with is that we cannot think about labor market needs as some kind of a fixed thing that's handed down to us from heaven. Labor market needs and labor demand is a function of the labor supply. So if you change your labor supply, that changes the kinds of jobs that are created. So the question then becomes, do you want a high-skill economy or a low-skill economy? If you go to the southern US, where there's large numbers of low-skilled immigrants, you will see jobs are done very differently than they are in Canada or in Northern Europe, where there's very little low-wage labor because minimum wages are so high. There's a lot more technological innovation going on. If you look at what happened in Italy during the pandemic, their temporary farm workers, migrant labor was shut off. You've seen a dramatic increase in the technology being used to harvest grapes in Italy because of that shutting off of that migrant worker supply. And so the point is, it's endogenous. The labor demand is endogenous. If you want high wage, low skill labor markets, the way to do it is not to fuel low wages by increasing flows of low skilled workers into those labor markets. And we're seeing that. I mean, labor shortages are something that business cries about, but if you care about reducing inequality in a country, you should not be afraid of labor shortages. Labor shortages that we're seeing now are something we should be arguably celebrating if your objective is to reduce inequality, right? So if your objective is to reduce inequality, your objective should not be low-skilled immigration. It should be high-skilled immigration, because what that does is it lowers wages, puts downward pressure on wages at the top end of the distribution, thereby reducing inequality. It doesn't put downward pressure on wages at the bottom end of the distribution, thereby exacerbating inequality, right? So, and then another reason why you want to emphasize human capital in selection is that what Phil mentioned is certainly there's this intergenerational evidence that immigrant parents that are highly educated, whether or not they themselves struggle to get that education, well, regardless of the quality of that education, they tend to put much more emphasis on the education of their kids. And so their kids end up doing much better. And there's lots of evidence of that in Canada. And so that agreement that in Canada, we're going to emphasize human capital accumulation, that's really, as I see it, and I was involved to some extent in the creation of this, or at least, consulting with IRCC or CIC at the time about express entry. I think it does what it seeks to do. It's a very clear objective. We're going to maximize the earnings of immigrants. We're going to screen based on some predictor of what their post-landing earnings are going to be. Those are what we call these comprehensive ranking system scores. It's just another layer and a point system above the traditional point system. And we're going to cream that. We're going to cream skim the applicants on a regular basis. Every 2 weeks, we're going to take the folks in the pool, in the applicant pool, with the highest CRS scores. Okay, and within that evaluation, the CRS scores are going to put a lot of weight on pre-migration language testing, credential assessment, and also whether or not you have host country labor market experience and education. And so what we've seen, the most recent evidence is that express entry has stabilized that deterioration. It's led to improved outcome. That cream skimming system has certainly improved outcomes. Okay, if you wonder what's going on during the pandemic, this is something that I've been talking to Jason Kirby at the Globe and Mail about. He's going to, I think, be writing an article about this, but I'm amazed that this has not received more attention. If you care about immigrants, you should be caring about this. This is an incredible success story in some respects. These are the employment rates of Canadian immigrants and also Canadian-born workers during the pandemic. So this is February 2020. So we're gonna put everybody's employment rate at a, normalize it at February 2020, and we're gonna say, well, what's happened since February 2020 to their employment rate? You can see that everybody initially, there was lots of job loss, employment rate fell, but look at what's happened to the green line. The green line are the most recent immigrants in Canada. These are recent immigrants in Canada. Their employment rate is now 7 to 8 percentage points higher than it was before the pandemic. Okay, we can talk about why this is, but express entry and the importance of having pre-landing employment arrangements is a huge part of this, unquestionably. And this is my last slide. So my concerns about the current policy shift, which seems to be quite real, and it isn't just a reflection of the pandemic, some of this was clearly going on before the pandemic, is that what we're seeing in Canada is a shift and a push away from that human capital model that clearly helped to stabilize earnings of new immigrants in Canada. And we're moving towards what looks like a population maximization objective. So now the objective is to maximize the number of immigrants. And a lot of the rationale for doing this seems to be about economics, about economic growth. And for economists, and I'm not unique in this, there isn't much logic in this. If your objective is to increase the total GDP of a country, you have to ask yourself, well, why would you ever stop at 401,000? We clearly don't have a supply problem. I think Philip or somebody already said this. I mean, in Canada, we could easily get more than four. If we had a complete open border with no screening whatsoever, we just said to the world, come to Canada. You get here, you're in permanently. I can guarantee you immigration inflows would be more than 401,000. Why don't we do that? That's gonna increase GDP. Every person who comes to Canada will contribute something to GDP. So why do we stop at 401,000? Well, the answer is, of course, that maximizing GDP is a ridiculous objective. That's not the objective. India has a higher GDP than Canada. Brazil has a higher GDP than Canada. I don't think that's what we're after. What we care about is when we take the total pie and we divide it between us, how big is each slice on average? And that's the objective. So it's GDP per capita that we're trying to maximize. And we know really well how to do that. There are really good models. I'm working on a paper now with Chris Forswick at Carleton, where we're going to just spell this out really clearly because it seems like people struggle with it. But you begin with a solo swan model of growth. These are very well established. You learn these models in graduate school, even undergrad nowadays. These are macroeconomic growth models. It's very clear when you take immigrants and you add them to an economy in these models, there's two big things that are happening in terms of Canada's situation. One is there's physical capital dilution, right? Because immigrants, for the most part, don't bring a lot of physical capital. They don't bring machinery. They don't bring buildings. They don't bring housing with them. They don't bring land with them. That gets diluted. And so there's less on average for every person. And that tends to lower wages. But the other thing they do is bring human capital. And that can potentially outdo that physical capital dilution and raise GDP per capita. There's no question immigrants have the potential to boost GDP per capita. But the challenge is that when you increase the quantity of immigration levels, then that average quality or average human capital of immigrants declines. There's a trade-off. You can't simultaneously increase the quantity and the average human capital. Why? Well, it's built into the CRS system. The comprehensive ranking system, it's built into that. When you increase immigration with a comprehensive ranking system, you have to lower the scores. And that's what's happened in Canada. So what's been called Super Saturday in mid-February of this year, that's what happened. They completely did away with the CRS scores. And in the first 45 days of this year, they admitted 38,000 immigrants. In the past 45 days, they've only admitted 4,000. It makes no sense to do that. Why would you go to the bottom of the barrel and get the lowest CRS scores in the first 45, and now you let the pool overflow? I mean, if you want to, dynamically optimize, you want to keep relatively the same CR score all the way through. And then the other thing is that the pathways for low-skilled workers who we're calling essential workers, but if you really think about it deeply, this word essential really doesn't have a lot of meaning. It's not clear what essential means. You have to ask yourself, if you got rid of migrant farm workers, if you shut off those inflows, what would happen? Would the economy suddenly, the deputy minister said we wouldn't have any fresh strawberries to eat anymore. Does that mean they're essential? Are fresh strawberries essential? I don't know. In my mind, they're not. So what you see is a lot of policy drift. You see a lot of policy drift where we're pushing for pathways for low-skilled workers. Really what we're doing is we're trying to reach humanitarian objectives. And I would actually support that. But we're doing it through an economic class program. And that's where we run into problems with the Tinbergen rule. Okay? And then the other question we have to ask ourselves, which I hear nobody asking, is when a migrant farm worker or a migrant truck driver is given PR, receives PR status, do they stay in those occupations? And if they don't, then the objective of trying to meet these skill shortages and jobs that Canadians apparently don't want, why do you think that's any different for immigrants? They're not gonna, so then they leave those jobs and you just got to bring in more. You're shooting yourself in the foot. So again, I just don't understand the rationale. Okay, that's it. Sorry, I really had to rush to meet you.
Thank you very much, Mikhail. This was, it's amazing to see an economist who is enthusiastic about what it is that they're saying. And believe me, this conversations and arguments, et cetera, are taking place all over the place. And there's no agreement on policy circles, as to what to do about it. There are lots of truth in there, but as you know,